Hello everyone, we are coming in for the second video of the month of August, and for this week's video we are going to cover something that kind of almost escaped my mind, that last week, last Thursday, Friday was the 50th anniversary of occurring, and to some of you, you may very well know it, but back 50 years ago, August of 1974, we had President Richard Nixon ended up being the first and so far only president in American history to end up resigning. So, if that gives you any clue as to what this video is, it is about the Watergate scandal. We are going to cover that today, as I don't think we ever have really covered that in any reality. And I debated waiting until I got to the video on Richard Nixon to do this, but there's so much information with Watergate, it's worthy of its own video, especially in regards to the investigations that happened, and I felt that waiting until I did the video on Richard Nixon for the President series would not fully go into depth of what exactly happened and how this eventually led to a resignation. We will touch upon Watergate again when that time comes, but this is the more in-depth look of what happened, which I didn't think would be quite possible to do with that video, since when we do that video, we're also looking at Nixon's presidential accomplishments that he did get that were good, and of course his career and life before and afterhand. So today we're going to cover the Watergate scandal that ended up causing the resignation of President Nixon and the end of the Nixon presidency. And that leads us to, we got to go all the way back to 1972, 2 years before Nixon would actually resign. So let's fast back forward the clock about 52 years. And we come to 1972. And if anyone is aware of your presidential history from 1972 or American politics at that time, Vietnam is going on. That is quite the divisive issue. Nixon is president. Nixon is running. He has coming to the end of his first term of office, and he's seeking to get another. He is seeking to run for reelection in 1972 for a second term. And that is where all this starts. In 1972, Nixon wants to be reelected. Vietnam is still embroiling the U.S., which has split the nation apart, and Nixon and his campaign staff saw the key to winning a reelection campaign in 1972 would be a forceful campaign that is as essential as including aggressive tactics against their opponents, which they viewed would be the most vital for their purposes of getting reelected. So, in the interest of Nixon getting reelected, they're going to pursue this aggressive campaign that nowadays, it's kind of come to light, also pursued some illegal activities that weren't exactly warranted or legal to do. And Nixon, part of the reason why Watergate as a whole happened, why the Nixon campaign was so undergoing these illegal activities, was partly due to Nixon's own personality. Nixon had served as vice president under President Dwight D. Eisenhower in the 1950s, and he had served as a congressman beforehand and had been involved in politics for some time. And Nixon was generally a good politician. But the problem with Nixon was he is very, very paranoid of enemies, of political enemies in particular. He is paranoid of rivals. He is paranoid of anyone that does not agree with him because he thinks they're plotting against him. And this was a major flaw in Nixon's character. He could never fully trust a political rival or someone that didn't agree with him politically because he constantly was on the lookout for potential enemies. And he would keep lists of people of who he thought were working against him and who he wanted to keep an eye on because he was afraid they would try something against him. And this personality flaw of Nixon's is perhaps one of the biggest contributors as to why Watergate and other events had happened, is because Nixon during the 1972 campaign, even though his aides are assuring him, even though there's a little bit of unrest, you still seem to be quite popular amongst the people. The Democrats are still fractured from 1968. They're not going to really have in their mind, Nixon has an easy path to reelection regardless. They don't really, most of the aides and staff don't see the need for these aggressive tactics. And Nixon, in his paranoid ways, is insisting that, well, they're plotting against me and they're going to work against me, and I need to go and I need to be the one that moves first over them. And I think that also encouraged Nixon to undergo some of these activities because of that paranoid delusion of everyone's out to get him that he was not a friend with. So in May of 1972, members of Nixon's Committee to Re-elect the President, also known as CREEP or CREEP as we'll call it, the Committee to Re-elect the President was basically Nixon's main re-election finance committee. And in May of 1972, members of this committee ended up breaking in to the Democratic Party National Committee headquarters in Washington, D.C. at the Watergate building complex. That is where the whole name of Watergate comes from. It comes from the building that was broken into. And it's still around. And I believe the Democratic National Committee in D.C. is still headquartered in that building. I could be wrong, but I think they still are. And while they broke into the Democratic National Committee headquarters building, they ended up stealing copies of top secret party documents and also bugged office phones in an attempt to basically get somewhat of an edge on the Democratic opposition for the upcoming presidential election. The idea was, we'll steal any campaign documents that we think could really help us, and then while we're in there, we'll also bug their phones and wire them so that we can kind of hear in on their conversations going on in the Democratic Party national headquarters. And that was the main goal here of this break-in in May 1972. That was the first break-in. They did not get caught on the first one. It was the second one that they got caught. The wiretaps, unfortunately for the burglars, had in the May break-in, had failed to actually work properly after they had put them in, and this led to 5 men then returning to the Watergate building on another second break-in on June 17th of 72. And as they were attempting to break in back into the Watergate building, one of the security guards in the building that night happened to notice that someone had been taping over the locks of the doors. And once he noticed this, he recognized, okay, somebody's in here trying to get into something. So he called the police immediately. The men were caught absolutely red-handed when the police arrived. They were caught in the act, and they were arrested on sight. Now, what was not known or clear at that time was that the men who were being arrested and who were burglarizing this building were connected to Nixon and his reelection campaign. That was not known quite yet. There were suspicions raised initially during the arrest of these men, mostly because detectives, upon going into the crime scene, ended up finding copies of the re-election committee's White House phone number among the burglars' belongings that they had dropped. And that kind of raised a couple eyebrows. I'm like, okay, these are burglars breaking into the Democratic Party National Committee headquarters, and they have documents and a phone number that connect back to the White House's re-election committee campaign to reelect Nixon, who is a Republican and who is obviously the political opponent to the Democrats in this upcoming presidential election. That did kind of raise some eyebrows right off the bat that these men had those phone numbers and documents on them. In August, however, of 72, as the investigation into the Watergate break-in begins, Nixon swore in a speech that his White House staff and himself were in no way involved in the break-in. And because the people still admired Nixon to a large degree at that time, a majority of voters took him at his word and believed Nixon when he said that I had nothing to do with this, my staff had nothing to do with this, they're not involved, this was an act of a couple hooligans. And the majority of the American voters did believe Nixon. And in November of 1972, Nixon won a landslide victory over Democratic candidate George McGovern. And he only lost, I believe, in that election. The only 2 states or territories that he lost were Massachusetts and Washington, D.C. But it was a landslide victory. Nixon had successfully won a re-election after ordering a break-in and suffered almost apparently no political consequences for it because no one had quite figured out yet that he was involved. And let's see here. We'll go through. We have a couple pictures here of some of the things used from the break-in here. So here is a picture from 2006, though, of the Watergate building complex in Washington, D.C. This was the complex that was broken into, that the burglars tried to go in there, steal any campaign documents they could get a hold of, and also wiretap the phones so that they could kind of listen on any conversations going on. And it's still there in D.C. to this day. Here is a filing cabinet this is a picture from the crime scene inside the headquarters office. A filing cabinet that was disturbed and actually damaged by the burglars trying to get into something inside the filing cabinet. Probably campaign documents, I'm going to guess. And here we have an image of one of the wiretapping devices that was kind of also found. That wasn't so much for the phones, but this one was hooked up to what would look like a chapstick thing. And this was a wiretapping device that they were going to put in there, but had not been able to. Served as a microphone as well. So this brings us to 1973. And this is where we come to the realization Nixon is not being truthful. He was involved in this break-in. A few days after the break-in, after the Watergate break-in had happened in June, the second one, a few days after it occurred, he had actually arranged to provide hundreds of thousands of dollars in hush money to be paid to the burglars from his reelection campaign fund. This was sent as hush money to the burglars while they're in jail, just basically say, okay, just be quiet about this, don't say a word, and I'll pay you well. Lately, I think we all know what hush money is because obviously Donald Trump recently has had some problems with hush money and paying it to the wrong people. So I think we're aware of what hush money is, but this is another instance of a president or former president paying hush money to somebody. And Nixon arranges for this hush money to be paid to the burglars to hopefully keep them quiet. And at the same time, Nixon and his aides devised a plan to order the CIA to impede the FBI's investigation into the Watergate investigation and break-in. That is where Nixon overstepped his bounds, was these two things. His plan to use the CIA was an absolute abuse of presidential power and a deliberate obstruction of justice. Nixon was abusing his authority and power over the CIA in order to order it to do something that was trying to impede a crime investigation, which was an obstruction of justice. And these two things were probably worse than the break-in itself. The break-in itself was a break-in, but now you're actually impeding, the criminal process of investigation into this crime, and you're using your power in a way that it is not intended to be used. That right there is what did Nixon in as complicit with this crime, was him trying to cover that up, more or less. Not just also the break-in to a degree, but these were the two big things that were even worse than the break-in, is that Nixon's deliberately trying to cover his involvement up and cover up any kind of connection to it. 7 conspirators of the break-in were indicted on charges to Watergate. After urging by Nixon aides, 5 of them would plead guilty to charges that were brought against them in order to avoid trial, and thus by avoiding trial, they wouldn't be brought up a bunch of testimony and forced to testify and everything else. So that was a way to kind of keep their mouth shut. If you just automatically agree to plead guilty, there's no trial, there's no drawn out, gathering evidence by the prosecutor, there's no you accidentally slipping up in court and mentioning something that connected back to us. So by avoiding the trial, they're also hoping to cover up Nixon's involvement. 5 of them ended up just doing that. Pleaded guilty, didn't avoid a trial going through it. The other 2 ended up going to trial and were convicted in January of 1973. So that brings us to January of 73. And at January of 73, this is where 2 figures come in who are still alive today. They're still around. And that is the Washington Post journalist investigators of Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein. By January 1973, several people who are investigating the Watergate break-in from the year prior are starting to kind of pick apart signs that there could be something bigger going on here, because certain things just aren't matching up. And some of the conspirators, namely the 2 that had gone to trial, had also begun to crack under pressure and start spewing things that they probably should not have spewed if they wanted to keep the president's involvement under top wraps. And Washington Post reporters Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, at the time both in their 20s, they are both alive today, in their 80s now, but they established contact in early 1973 with a whistleblower anonymously known as Deep Throat. Now, Deep Throat was actually William Mark Felt, who was at the time the number 2 at the FBI, and he was mainly in contact with Woodward under this moniker of Deep Throat. He did not really get any contact with Bernstein, and the whole moniker of Deep Throat had come from a 1972 pornographic film that had come out, if anyone's wondering where that name come from. And that was the name that he used. Now, during his communication with Woodward, he would speak with Woodward over 17 times, starting from June of 1972 to November of 1973. And during these 17 times, it was most of the time by phone, except for one time where they met in person at a parking garage in Virginia. Although during this entire time, he remained anonymous with Woodward. He would not give out his real name. It was not actually revealed until 2005, 3 years before Felt's death, that he had been deep throat. So until 2005, we had not known who this man was until then, that he had come out and just blatantly admitted that, oh yeah, that was me. So during the 17 times that he spoke with Woodward, Felt never allowed Woodward, to quote him directly. He would never allow him to basically use his name in anything or even list him as a source. And during this entire time, he fed them information that at first only confirmed existing leads that Woodward and Bernstein had concerning what they knew about the Watergate break-in and what was going on. As the information keeps coming from Felt, who is inside the FBI, and starting to tell them that it looks like the president's trying to impede this investigation, they start getting more information that eventually helps them to connect the payments deposited into the burglars' accounts to the Nixon reelection campaign fund made by the Creep. So in October of 1973, the FBI officially determined that the Watergate operation had been a setup of spying and sabotage by Nixon aides in order to support his reelection. So at this point, the FBI, by October of 1973, has determined Watergate was indeed involved and connected to the president's reelection campaign because it was carried out mostly by his aides. They do not know whether or not the president was directly involved. That is now the question. Was he involved at all? Nixon, of course, would deny it. And White House aides, including White House counsel John Dean, would actually testify to a grand jury that Nixon had been the one to order the break-in. They basically, the conspirators are caught now. The aides have been caught, so they're bringing the whole ship down with them. They ain't going down alone and taking a bullet for the guy. And John Dean testified to this grand jury that, oh yeah, the president directly ordered this break-in. We only did it on his orders. And Dean also stated what was a very crucial part of this information and what would become the big battle for the next year is Dean had stated that, and several of the other aides had confirmed it, that Nixon secretly tape recorded all the conversations that went on in the Oval Office, be it a conversation he had in person or be it one that he had over the phone. But he tape recorded every conversation in the Oval Office. So Dean said if the prosecutors could obtain those tapes from Nixon, they would have irreputable proof of Nixon being complicit in the break-in because it would have recorded those conversations of them discussing that with the president. Nixon, of course, refuses to hand over any of the tapes, insisting through his lawyers that he did not need to hand over the tapes because they were covered by the president's executive privilege that technically would allow him to withhold the tapes for himself and he didn't have to give them up to anybody because of executive privilege. Now, what does that sound like? It sounds a lot like Donald Trump recently, who has kind of used the whole thing of presidential immunity or presidential executive privilege to block him releasing certain documents and stuff. And while he was president, that applied, but then there was things that come out after he left office where he tried to claim presidential immunity and presidential executive privilege. And I'm like, okay, but there's one brilliant problem with your defense, dude. You're not president anymore. That doesn't apply when you're not in office. But he used kind of that same line that Nixon was using. Nixon used the same excuse to try to deny giving up the tape recordings from his office because he knew they would implicate him if they were given up. So throughout the fall of 1973, Judge John Sirica and a Senate committee and independent special prosecutor Archibald Cox, all three of these groups are trying to get a hold of these tapes, and Nixon is fighting tooth and nail to keep them from them because he knows what will happen if they get them. So this is going to be the big fight through the fall of 1973 into pretty much almost the end of the Watergate scandal up in August of 1974 until Nixon finally ends up going to have to hand over these tapes. And here we have So these are back in the 70s pictures of Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein. They were working for the Washington Post at the time. This is Bob, and this is Carl Bernstein. They were both working. Woodward was the one that would be in contact most of the time with Deep Throat or William Felt, and then he would relay that information back to Bernstein and give that back to him. This was Deep Throat. This was William Felt. He died in 2008, but he was the whistleblower from the FBI that was giving Woodward this inside information that was kind of tipping them off that there was involvement from the president. And then this is White House Special Counsel John Dean. He ended up also going to jail for his connection into the whole scandal, but he was the one that kind of led on probably the most importantly, that Nixon had tape recordings of all the Oval Office conversations that had gone on, and he was the one that tipped the prosecutors off that if you can get your hands on those tapes, you can kind of you can find the president's complicity in this whole situation. So that leads us to October of 1973, with this comes out with the famous Saturday Night Massacre, and this is really going to be something that's going to stand out during the Watergate proceedings, and as part of Nixon's attempt to really keep his involvement covered up. Archibald Cox was a special prosecutor that had been appointed by the Justice Department to oversee this case, and he had kept demanding for Nixon to turn over the tapes to him as part of his investigation, and Nixon's refusing. But since the president is also in charge of the Justice Department, Nixon felt that the guy was kind of overstepping his bounds, even though he wasn't, because he felt, I'm technically your boss. When I say you're going to stop pursuing this, you're going to stop pursuing this. And the guy's saying, well, I'm also in charge of the case, and the case says I need these. So guess what? I want them. And because Cox refused to stop his demand for the tapes, Nixon ordered him to be fired try to stop his demand for the tapes and try to keep it covered up. Several of the Justice Department officials resigned in protest because of Nixon's demand to have him fired before somebody actually went ahead and did it. So I think he went through about 3 or 4 Justice Department officials that resigned instead of firing Cox because they realized that this is an abuse of power, this is obstruction of justice. I'm not doing this. I'm not going down with you. And by resigning, they thus avoided getting implicated themselves when later charges were brought up a year later. But this happened on Saturday night, October 20th, 1973, that Nixon went through this. The funny thing was for Nixon, the replacement that they put for special prosecutor in Cox's replacement after Cox was fired also demanded the tape. So it hadn't gained Nixon anything because the new replacement for Cox was demanding the same thing that he had fired Cox for. And because of that, the Nixon decided, okay, I will release some of the tapes, but not all of them, because I can withhold the ones that are really incriminating. But I will release some to hopefully placate the media and placate, these prosecutors and make them think there's nothing. They knew better, but Nixon and his paranoid delusions thought that this was going to be enough. So in April of 1974, I think, was when he eventually released part of the tapes, or at least a handful of them, but he still refused to hand over all of them, and that caused the prosecutors to still pursue it in court, trying to get him to hand over all of these tapes. So in early 1974, the cover up and the investigation impediment are beginning to unravel in front of Nixon, and he's faced with the real possibility that he's going to get implicated in this. In March of 1974, a grand jury indicted 7 of Nixon's former aides on various charges relating to the Watergate break-in. However, one of the most critical and most interesting parts of that indictment was the members of the jury were unsure if they could indict a sitting president. That was the only thing that probably held them back from indicting Nixon. There was more than enough evidence, there was more than enough testimony to support indicting the president. The question was, it was such an unprecedented thing. We've never had to indict a former president before, so can we even do it? or do we have to wait till he's out of office? And that's still a debate that rages today in some points of whether or not a sitting president can be indicted for crimes. And I think in some ways the Supreme Court pretty much answered that question right off the bat about a month or two ago, and they pretty much gave a broad presidential immunity that is quite appalling in my view, because you could essentially order a political hit on an opponent lawyers for Donald Trump's lawyers during that case, because he was the plaintiff. He had argued that when the judge had asked him, what if a sitting president orders a political assassination on his political opponent? Would that constitute immunity? And the lawyer pretty much, long story short, said, yeah, the president would be immune from prosecution in that because he's president. And the Supreme Court, by giving that, has given a broad presidential immunity that I think flies right in the face of what the presidential founders wanted, because the presidential founders did not want a king. That's why they created a president. It was something new and novel, and they didn't want to give it all that much authority. And unfortunately, that's where this country is going. But this grand jury ended up deciding that we don't think we can indict the president. We don't know if we can. So since we're unsure, in this indictment of these 7 other aides, we are going to officially name that Nixon is quote, an unindicted co-conspirator in this whole mess up. The fight for the tapes would eventually reach the Supreme Court in the summer of 1974, and in July, the Supreme Court in the United States versus Nixon case ended up ordering that Nixon had to surrender all of the tapes. They ordered that presidential immunity did not apply, that his executive privilege did not apply in this situation, that he needed to hand over the tapes to the congressional committee that was overseeing the investigation of the Watergate break-in. And is into what was going on at the time, the House had already called for an impeachment inquiry into the president back in March, and he was to hand it over to them as well. And due to the Supreme Court's order, the House Judiciary Committee had already voted to impeach Nixon. They had not voted yet, but they had voted to adopt 4 impeachment articles. Among those were obstruction of justice, abuse of power, and criminal cover-up, among the 4 articles of impeachment they had ended up drafting for him. Nixon continued to drag his feet even after the Supreme Court's ruling against him, and he did not officially release the tapes until August 5th. And when he did, it was done. Because one of the tapes, what they call the smoking gun tape, was him talking with Haldeman, one of his aides, and Haldeman's in the office basically telling him, and you can go right online and find this tape and listen to the audio. And Haldeman, it's June of 1972, and Haldeman is talking about the FBI. It's getting out of control. The FBI investigation is going in a direction that we do not want it to go, because we know it's going to implicate some people, and it's out of control, and you need to get a whole control of it. And Nixon basically agreeing with Haldeman, saying, okay, we're going to keep this under wraps. We're going to play it tough. They play it tough, so now we're going to play it at their game. It's the smoking gun tape, because it's Nixon directly talking about the break-in, and you can hear the aide telling him, you need to get control of the FBI, because this investigation of theirs is starting to go in a direction we don't want it to go. That was August 5th. Faced with undeniable proof of his complicity in the Watergate crimes and almost certain impeachment by Congress and removal from office upon it happening, Congress had, mind you, many people messed it up. Nixon was never officially impeached. Impeachment proceedings were going on against him, and had he stayed in office, he would have been impeached. And it's very likely that had he been impeached, Nixon also would have been the first president to ever have been removed from office through impeachment. And Nixon wisely kind of summed up his situation, realized there's no path here that ends with me retaining the presidency. There's no path that ends with this. The evidence is too incriminating. The House will vote to impeach me and remove me from office if I stay. So, faced with the undeniable proof of his complicity in it and the near certain removal from office by impeachment, Nixon officially came onto television on the night of August 8th and announced that he would be resigning the presidency the next day. and he ended up resigning at noon on August 9th, and Vice President Gerald Ford ended up being sworn in as president. Mind you, Gerald Ford had only taken office in December of 73 after Nixon's first vice president, Spiro Agnew, had also resigned over tax fraud convictions. But Ford is technically the only president in American history who can claim that he was never technically elected because he was never elected on a presidential ticket, so thus he was never elected running for president, and he was never elected running for vice president either. He was appointed from the Republicans in the House in December of 1973 upon Nixon's nomination for him to fill in the vacant vice presidency role. And it was Congress who had confirmed him, not the American people. And thus, when Ford took office on August 9th, some people didn't like the fact that now we have a president that wasn't even elected by the people. The big move came. Now the question is, after Nixon's resignation on August 9th, will he be charged? Because it's become more than obvious now he was involved in this. And the question is now, are we going to charge him? Will he be charged like all these other aides have been? And there were quite a few people gearing up to charge Nixon over these crimes. And President Ford at the time didn't want the nation to really go on Watergate anymore. He wanted to move past the divisions that it had spurned. He wanted to move past that painful chapter and wanted to move forward. So 6 weeks after Nixon had left office, Ford issued what is perhaps his most controversial move that he ever did. He officially pardoned Nixon. He issued a presidential pardon for Nixon of any and all crimes that he may have committed while in office. And that meant Nixon was forgiven. He could not be charged for any of the Watergate break-in stuff, and he officially had a presidential pardon. This was broadly unpopular with the American people back in 1974, and Ford did end up paying for it. In 1976, when he tried to run for re-election to get a term of his own that had not been inherited from someone else, Ford ended up getting beat by Jimmy Carter, and a major contributor to the reason why he lost to Carter was people did not agree with him having pardoned Nixon over Watergate. And that was a major contributor to why he lost the election of 76. So Ford ended up paying for that pardon because the American people were not with him on that issue. They wanted Nixon prosecuted because I think in their eyes, Nixon had lied to them in 72 and said, I had nothing to do with this. They had believed him. And to them, I think it was an issue of you betrayed our trust. We trusted you. We voted for you re-election because you insisted you had nothing to do with this, only for this revelation to come out and then you resign. To them, that was a big blow, and they wanted to see Nixon prosecuted for his crimes, and Ford robbed them of that opportunity with that. Now, Ford, I understand in his own end, he thought it was doing the right thing, and in some ways, it did help the nation get over Watergate a little quicker. So perhaps that is the positive sign. But to the majority of the American people, they were not thrilled with Nixon getting that pardon after leaving office. Several of Nixon's aides, however, that had been implicated in the Watergate scandal were not anywhere near as lucky as Nixon had gotten to be. Some were convicted of serious offenses and then sent to federal prison. Among these were former Attorney General John Mitchell, who ended up serving 19 months in prison for his part in the cover-up operation with the FBI and the CIA, Watergate mastermind and former FBI agent G. Gordon Liddy, who had been the entire progenitor of the Watergate break-in plan. He ended up serving 4.5 years in prison, and I think he just died 3 years ago. And Chief of Staff H.R. Haldeman, who had been implicated with the smoking gun tape of him talking with Nixon saying the FBI investigation was going somewhere that they did not want it to go unless he started interfering and getting them under control. He ended up spending 19 months in prison, and then Nixon aide John Ehrlichman spent 18 months for trying to cover up the break-in as well. And there were many other aides that were also implicated, but these were some of the big breakout names that were. Nixon, up until his death in 1994, always insisted he never admitted any wrongdoing, any criminal wrongdoing in Watergate, up until his dying day, and never admitted to any wrongdoing at all with the Watergate break-in. But the only thing that he did seemingly admit was there had been very poor judgment on his part during the whole scandal. He never admitted to criminal wrongdoing, but admitted that his judgment had been quite poor during that whole scenario. And here's some protesters outside the Capitol in October of 1973. Obviously, you can kind of tell what they're wanting. They're wanting Congress to try to impeach Nixon over his perceived crimes with the Watergate scandal. Here we have an image of Nixon in April of 1974 when he's announcing on television that he's going to release some of the tapes, but not all of them because he knows what it'll implicate if he does. Here we have a picture of former Attorney General John Mitchell, who was later served about 19 months in prison, in federal prison, because of his implication in trying to keep the FBI's investigation, impeded, and trying to keep the CIA used as the tool that would be used to impede that investigation. Mitchell ended up serving 19 months in prison for that. And here is a picture of Nixon leaving the White House shortly before his resignation became official at noon, with them departing the White House and President Ford over here. And this picture's kind of misleading too, because they almost make it seem like a joyous occasion here. Nixon, maybe Pat Nixon looks somewhat happy. I don't know, but like Nixon, it looks kind of solemn, like they were like saying, "Oh yeah, goodbye. We're sorry you had to leave." This should not have been, I don't think, the solemn occasion it was. Nixon should have been made to resign in disgrace, and in some ways he was. He is the only president in American history to do that. And ironically, I think one of the funny things was Henry Kissinger, Nixon's Secretary of State, who just died last December. He, at age 100, Kissinger tried to claim that Nixon would go down in the annals of American history as a great president, that he would go down, that Watergate would be a minor footnote, that he would not be remembered for it. And ironically, I think Kissinger was wrong on that. As much credit as everyone tries to give Kissinger, he was wrong on many things. And that was one I think he's been particularly wrong, because when people think of Richard Nixon, they think of Watergate. They think of Nixon leaving office. They don't really think right off the bat of his accomplishments with China and getting out of the Vietnam War. They don't really think about that at all. The first thing that comes to their mind is Watergate. And so in that regard, one of Nixon's own cabinet members was quite wrong. The common American public, to this day, they don't, when they think of Nixon, the first thing on their mind, it isn't his accomplishments. It's the way that he left office and the disgrace that brought to this country and to himself. So that wraps up the video on the Watergate scandal. Just the video that, given now it's now been officially 50 years, I felt needed to be kind of covered, and I felt that we needed to give it appropriate time on its own to really go through. So if anyone has any questions, any comments, any added information you want to put in, feel free to put that in the comment section below as always. And we will be back, I don't know when next week, but we will be back next week for our third video for August. And then we'll have our president video the following week for August, since we do one every month. So if anyone has any suggestions for next week's video, also be sure to put that in the comment, and I'll be sure to go through them. So until next week, hopefully everyone stays well, and we'll see you for the next video.